There was a sound you could hear coming from a black kitchen on a Sunday morning in the 1930s that you will never hear again. It wasn't loud. It was almost nothing. Just the soft simmer of a pot that had been on the stove since before the sun came up. And underneath it, the scrape of a wooden spoon against cast iron that had fed 3 generations before it ever touched your plate. That sound meant something. It meant somebody in that house had figured out how to turn almost nothing into a meal that felt like everything. Because here's what a lot of folks don't understand about the way black families ate back then. It wasn't about being poor. Everybody knew what poor was. Poor wasn't a secret. Poor wasn't shameful. What mattered was what you did with it. What mattered was that a woman could walk into a kitchen with a quarter's worth of ingredients and a whole lot of love, and come out 2 hours later with something that made her children forget, just for a little while, that there wasn't much else in that house. These meals didn't have names in cookbooks. Nobody wrote them down. They passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from grandmother to grandbaby, standing on a stool by the stove, watching, memorizing, learning without knowing they were learning. And one by one, generation by generation, they have been disappearing, quietly, without anybody noticing until it's too late to ask the person who knew how to make them. Today we're going back to 25 of those meals, the ones made for pennies, the ones that fed whole families through the hardest years this country ever handed black folks. By the time we get to the end of this list, I think you're going to understand something about your own family you didn't understand before we started. Hey family, I'm James, and today we're going back, way back, to the kitchens of the Depression years and the Jim Crow South, to the tables where black families stretched a nickel further than anybody thought a nickel could go. Now, before we get into it, if this is your first time sitting at this table with me, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're building something here. A place where these memories don't just disappear into the past. So, go on, hit subscribe, ring that little bell, and let's get into it, family. Number 1, pot liquor and cornbread. Before there was a name for it, before anybody called it nose to tail or wrote it up in a magazine, black women in the South had already figured out that you don't throw away the water you boiled your greens in. That water, they called it pot liquor, had more nutrition sitting at the bottom of that pot than most of what came out of a can. Collard greens, mustard greens, turnip greens, whatever was growing, or whatever a neighbor had extra of, all of it went into a big pot with a piece of fatback if you had it. Sometimes just a ham hock bone that had already been used 2 or 3 times before. That pot would simmer low all day long, filling the house with a smell that meant supper was coming, even if supper was still hours away. When it was ready, you didn't throw out that liquid. You poured it into a bowl, crumbled a piece of cornbread down into it, and that was the meal. Not a side dish. The meal. My granddaddy used to say, a man could work a full day in the field on a bowl of pot liquor and cornbread and not complain once, because it filled him up and it tasted like something somebody cared enough to make right. Now, Big Mama, she used to say the liquor was where all the strength of the greens ended up anyway. The greens themselves were just there to flavor the water. She wasn't wrong. You won't see that today. Folks throw that water right down the drain without a second thought, not knowing their own grandmother would have considered that close to a sin. Number 2, fried cornmeal mush. Back in those days, cornmeal was one of the few things a family could count on having in the house, no matter how bad the week had gotten. It was cheap, it kept, and it could be made a dozen different ways depending on what else you had, which was usually nothing. Mush was what you made when there was truly nothing else. You boiled cornmeal in water with a little salt until it thickened up into something close to porridge, poured it into a loaf pan, and let it sit overnight in the icebox until it firmed up solid. The next morning, you'd slice it thick, fry it in whatever grease was left in the skillet from the night before. Bacon grease if you were fortunate, plain lard if you weren't, until each side had a crust on it the color of a chestnut. You'd put a little syrup on top if you had syrup that week, and if you didn't, you ate it plain and didn't say a word about it. Child, let me tell you something. That was breakfast, dinner, and sometimes supper too, 3 days running. And nobody in that house complained, because complaining didn't put anything else on the table. It just meant somebody had gone without, so somebody else could eat. That was just how it was done. Number 3, neck bones and rice. If chicken was for Sunday and a whole hog was for hog killing time in the fall, then neck bones were for every day in between. The butcher would practically give them away because white folks didn't want them, and most people didn't think there was any meat worth the trouble on a neckbone. But a black woman who knew what she was doing could take a pound of neckbones, a pot of water, an onion if she had one, and turn out a gravy so rich and so dark you'd have thought there was a whole roast hiding in that pot. You'd cook those bones down for hours until the meat gave up and fell right off, until the broth turned thick enough to coat a spoon. Then you'd serve it over a mountain of white rice, and every single person at that table would pick their bone clean and suck the marrow out of the middle, because wasting marrow was wasting the best part, and nobody in that house was raised to waste the best part of anything. The whole block would smell it on Sunday evenings sometimes, if Sunday's chicken had run out early in the week and Neckbones had to fill in the gap. Nobody thought less of a family for it. Everybody was doing some version of the same thing. Number 4, biscuits and cane syrup. This one right here. This is something we need to bring back, if for no other reason than to remember how little it took to make a child happy back then. Flour, lard, buttermilk if you had it, water if you didn't, a pinch of salt, and whatever leavening was in the tin. That was a biscuit. No eggs, no sugar. Just enough to hold together and rise a little in a hot oven. And when they came out, split open, steam still rising off them, you didn't need butter because half the time there wasn't any. You had cane syrup or sorghum, if that's what grew near you, and you poured it slow into the middle of that split biscuit and let it soak down into the flour until the whole thing turned the color of a Sunday afternoon. That was dessert. That was the treat. A child in 1938 didn't know what a candy bar tasted like most weeks, but he knew exactly what a biscuit with syrup dripping off the edge tasted like. And 40, 50 years later, that same man would tell you it was the best thing he ever put in his mouth, and he wasn't exaggerating one bit. Number 5, poke salad. Now this one takes some explaining because poke salad, or poke salad depending on who raised you, comes from a plant that most folks today would walk right past without knowing you could eat it. Pokeweed grew wild along fence rows and ditch banks all over the rural South. And if you knew what you were looking for, and more importantly, if you knew how to prepare it, because that plant is dangerous if you don't, you had yourself a green vegetable that didn't cost a single penny. You had to boil those leaves not once, not twice, but 3 times, pouring off the water each time because the raw plant carried something in it that could make a person sick. Big Mama knew exactly how many times, exactly how long, without ever measuring or timing anything because she'd learned it from her mother, who'd learned it from a woman who might have learned it back during slavery itself, when eating what grew free along the road was sometimes the only way a family ate at all. After the 3rd boil, you'd fry it up with a little grease and maybe a scrambled egg mixed through it if the hens were laying that week. It tasted a little bitter, a little green, nothing like the collards or the mustards, but it was free, and free mattered more some weeks than anything else in the world. Number 6, souse meat. Folks don't do this anymore, and that's a shame, because souse meat, what some called head cheese, though it wasn't cheese at all, was one of the most resourceful dishes to come out of hog killing season. When a family slaughtered a hog in the late fall, nothing was wasted, nothing. The head, the feet, the ears, all the parts a store today would throw straight in the trash, went into a big pot and cooked down for hours until the meat fell away from bone and cartilage. That meat got picked clean, seasoned heavy with vinegar, red pepper, and salt, packed tight into a loaf pan, and left to cool until the natural gelatin in it set the whole thing into a firm, sliceable block. Cold, sliced thin, maybe on a piece of light bread. It was a delicacy in houses that couldn't afford delicacies. It lasted through the cold months in a way fresh meat never could, sitting in a cool spot in the kitchen, feeding a family a slice or two at a time until it was gone. We didn't have much, but we had everything that mattered. And part of what mattered was knowing how to make a hog last a family through an entire winter without a single part of that animal going to waste. Number 7, chitterlings. Now, I know some of you already know exactly where I'm going with this one, and some of you are wrinkling your nose right about now, and that's all right, because chitterlings were never meant to be for everybody. They were meant for the folks who understood that the parts of the hog nobody else wanted were the parts that, cleaned right and cooked right, could feed a family through the hardest part of winter. Cleaning them was a whole day's work by itself. Hours at the sink, hours of a smell that would clear a kitchen if you didn't know what was coming. But once they were clean, once they went into that pot with onion and vinegar and pepper and simmered low for half a day, the smell turned from something you'd want to run from into something that pulled the whole family toward the kitchen. It was Christmas food in a lot of houses, New Year's food. The one time of year when a family that couldn't afford a ham or a big cut of beef could still put something on the table that felt like a celebration, because it took all day, because everybody in the house had a hand in it at some point, and because eating them together at the same table at the same time was its own kind of holiday. Number 8, fatback and gravy. There is a particular kind of poverty that most people today have never had to know, and it's the kind where meat isn't the meal. Meat is the flavor, and the meal is everything built around that flavor. Fatback was cheap. It was fat more than meat. And a single small piece could season an entire pot of beans, an entire skillet of greens, or, cut thin and fried crisp, could turn into gravy rich enough to cover a whole pan of biscuits. You'd fry that fatback low and slow until the fat rendered out into the pan, then you'd sprinkle a little flour into that hot grease, stir it constant so it wouldn't scorch, and pour in milk or water until it thickened into a gravy the color of wet sand. Poured over biscuits, over rice, sometimes just eaten with a spoon straight from the pan when there was nothing else in the house to put it on. My granddaddy worked 6 days a week and never once complained, and part of the reason he never complained is because he came home to a plate of fatback gravy and biscuits that his wife had made stretch far enough to feed him and 5 children on wages that most people today wouldn't believe a man could raise a family on at all. Number 9, crackling cornbread. When hogs were killed and the fat was rendered down into lard, what was left behind in the bottom of that pot were little crisp pieces of skin and fat called cracklings. Most folks today have never tasted them, and that's a loss because cracklings added into a pan of cornbread turned a plain, humble bread into something with crunch. Something with a little pop of salt and fat in every bite. You'd fold those cracklings right into the cornmeal batter before it hit the hot grease in the skillet. And when that cornbread came out of the oven, the crust wasn't just golden. It was studded all through with these little crackling pockets that made a child fight over the corner pieces, because the corners had the most crunch. That right there. That is something we need to bring back. Not because we're hungry the way they were hungry, but because a family used to sit around a table fighting playfully over cornbread corners. And there was a kind of joy in that scarcity that a full refrigerator has a way of erasing without anybody noticing it's gone. Number 10. Vinegar pie. Now this is one of those dishes that tells you everything about the ingenuity of the women who made it, because vinegar pie exists for one simple reason. There wasn't always money for lemons. A family wanting the bright tart taste of a lemon pie, but with no lemons anywhere near the house and no money to buy them, even if a store had them, would reach for a splash of vinegar instead. Mixed with sugar, a little butter, a little flour to thicken, and baked in a crust made from lard, because that's what there was. That pie came out tasting close enough to lemon that a child who'd never had a real lemon pie in his life would never know the difference. It was a trick in a way, a beautiful, resourceful trick, played by women who refused to let their children go without a treat just because the ingredients for a proper one weren't sitting on any shelf they could afford. You won't see that today. Vinegar pie has all but disappeared because nobody needs to trick their children into thinking they had lemons anymore. But there was a kind of love in that trick that a real lemon pie, bought easy from any store, could never quite match. Now, family, let me tell you something real quick. I want to pause right here for a second, because everything we've talked about so far, pot liquor, neckbones, crackling cornbread, these are more than just old recipes. They're a piece of something we almost lost completely. I put together something called the Soul Roots Cookbook, 100 forgotten Black American recipes, written out the way Big Mama would have done it, complete, patient, and true, with the measurements and the little secrets that never made it onto paper until now. The link is right there in the description and pinned in the comments below. You can also scan that code on your screen right now if that's easier for you. These recipes are disappearing one generation at a time, family. Don't let the ones you love lose them too. Number 11, buttermilk and cornbread. There were nights, plenty of them, when supper was simply this. A glass of cold buttermilk and a wedge of cornbread crumbled right down into it until the whole thing turned thick as porridge. No meat, no vegetable, just bread and milk. eaten with a spoon, and it was enough because it had to be enough. And children who grew up eating that way grew up strong anyhow, because their mothers made sure of it. Buttermilk was cheap, or free if the family kept a cow or traded with a neighbor who did. Cornbread was cheaper still. Put together, they made a cool, filling supper on a hot summer evening when nobody wanted the stove running any longer than it had to. Old folks called it a sop. And there was something almost ceremonial about the way you'd break the bread down piece by piece, watching it soak, waiting for it to reach just the right thickness before the first spoonful. We didn't have much, but we had everything that mattered, and on those nights, what mattered was a full stomach and a mother who'd figured out, once again, how to make something out of almost nothing. Number 12. Rice and gravy. If you grew up in certain parts of the rural South during the leanest years, you know exactly what rice and gravy meant. And it didn't always mean there was meat involved. Sometimes it did. A little grease from whatever had been fried that week, a little flour, a little water, browned down slow until it turned dark and rich. But some weeks, the gravy had no meat in it at all. It was flour, water, salt, and browning, cooked down until it thickened, poured over a mountain of rice, because rice was the one thing that could be bought cheap in bulk and stretched across an entire week. Big Mama, she used to say a family could survive on rice and gravy the way a soldier survives on rations, not thriving, not growing fat, but surviving, staying strong enough to work the next day and the day after that. There was no shame attached to it in the houses that made it. Everybody around you was making some version of the same thing. And there was a quiet dignity in knowing you'd found a way to put something warm on the table one more night. Number 13. Chicken gizzards and feet. When a chicken was killed for Sunday dinner, that bird fed the family in ways that went far past the breasts and the thighs. The feet, scalded and skinned, went into the pot for flavor, and for their own particular kind of tender, gelatinous meat that some in the family fought over. The gizzards, cleaned and simmered until tender, then floured and fried crisp, became a delicacy of their own, a little bit chewy, a little bit rich, gone in about 3 bites and never enough to satisfy everybody who wanted a piece. Nothing on that bird went in the trash. Nothing. The feet, the neck, the gizzard, the heart, the liver, all of it had a place. All of it fed somebody. A whole chicken in a family of 8 didn't mean 8 pieces of chicken breast. It meant a whole afternoon of a mother figuring out how to divide one bird 8, 9, 10 ways, and make sure everybody left that table believing they'd gotten a fair share, even the ones who quietly hadn't. Number 14. Watermelon rind preserves. Come summertime, when watermelon was cheap and plentiful, a family would eat the sweet red heart of it, and then, instead of tossing the rind straight in the trash the way most folks do today, that rind went into a pot with sugar, spices, sometimes a little vinegar, and cooked down slow into a preserve that would keep in jars through the fall and winter months. It took the part of the melon everybody else threw away and turned it into something sweet enough to spread on a biscuit come January, when fresh fruit of any kind was nowhere to be found, and money for store-bought jam didn't exist. Child, let me tell you something. There was a whole philosophy in that jar of preserves, and the philosophy was this. Nothing God gave you was meant to be wasted, not one bit of it, not if you looked hard enough for a use. Number 15. Beans and Fatback. Pinto beans, lima beans, whatever variety was cheapest that particular season, soaked overnight and simmered the next day with a small piece of fatback for flavor, was as close to a guaranteed meal as a poor family could count on. A pound of dried beans, bought for pennies, could feed a family of 6 or 7 for 2, sometimes 3 nights running, served over rice or alongside a piece of cornbread. There was a rhythm to it. Beans on Monday. Something else Tuesday if the week had started off good. Beans again by Thursday if it hadn't. Nobody kept a calendar of it, but every child in that house knew, without being told, which nights were going to be bean nights, and they learned early not to make a fuss about it, because a fuss didn't change what was in the pantry, and a mother tired from a full day's work didn't need a child's complaint added on to everything else she was already carrying. Number 16. Hoe cakes. Before there was a stove in every house, and even after there was, some families still made their cornbread the old way, patted flat by hand into a round cake and fried directly in a skillet, The way it was said, field hands used to cook their bread on the flat blade of a hoe over an open fire, which is where the name is said to have come from. Cornmeal, water, salt. Sometimes a little grease worked into the batter, patted thin, fried on both sides until it had a crust dark and crisp enough to crackle when you broke it. It was faster than baking a pan of cornbread in the oven, which mattered on a morning when there wasn't time to spare, and it used less fuel, which mattered when every stick of wood or scoop of coal cost something a family didn't have extra of. A hoe cake and a cup of coffee, sometimes coffee stretched thin with chicory or made mostly of hot water and just a little coffee to color it, was breakfast for a working man heading out before the sun was even all the way up. Number 17. Egg and syrup sandwich. On the mornings when a hen had laid and there was a single egg to be had, and nothing else in the house to go alongside it, a mother might fry that one egg, lay it on a piece of light bread, and drizzle a little syrup over the top before folding it closed. It sounds strange to a lot of people hearing it today, sweet syrup and a savory fried egg together on the same piece of bread. But ask anybody who grew up eating it, and they'll tell you it remains to this day one of the most comforting things they have ever tasted. That sandwich meant a mother had found a way to make one egg feel like enough. It meant she'd taken the smallest thing she had in the house and dressed it up just enough that her child felt cared for instead of shorted. This right here, this is something we need to bring back, if only to remember how little it actually takes to make a child feel like the world hasn't forgotten about them. Number 18. Turnip green stems. Most people today, if they cook turnip greens at all, buy them already stripped of their stems, the tough fibrous part discarded before the bag even reaches the store shelf. But in a house where nothing got wasted, those stems were peeled, chopped fine, and cooked right alongside the leaves, sometimes cooked longer because they needed the extra time to soften up. Big Mama, she used to say, the stems held just as much goodness as the leaves, and throwing them away was throwing away food a family couldn't afford to throw away. She'd stand at that counter with a paring knife, peeling the tough outer layer off each stem one at a time, patient in a way that a woman with more money and less time never would have needed to be. That patience, that refusal to waste even the toughest, least glamorous part of the vegetable, was its own kind of inheritance, passed down whether the next generation realized they were receiving it or not. Now, before we keep going, family, I want to hear from you. Out of everything we've talked about so far, which one hit closest to home? Was it the pot liquor, the vinegar pie? Was there a dish in your own family, something your grandmother made that stretched a little bit of nothing into supper for everybody that you haven't thought about in years until just now? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I promise you, somebody else reading right along with you is going to see their own Big Mama in what you write. Number 19. A molasses candy. Sugar was a luxury in a lot of these houses, something bought in small amounts and rationed carefully through the month. But molasses, dark and thick and cheap, was almost always somewhere in the kitchen, and on a special evening, a birthday, a good report card, sometimes just a Friday when the week had gone easier than expected. A mother might heat that molasses down with a little butter until it thickened, then pour it out onto a buttered plate to cool and harden into a candy that children would break apart with their hands and suck on slow, making it last as long as it possibly could. There was no wrapper, no brand name, no store-bought sweetness measured out to the exact same taste every single time. Just molasses, butter, and a mother's decision that tonight, of all nights, her children deserved something sweet, even if she had to make that sweetness herself out of the cheapest ingredients sitting on her own shelf. Number 20. Government commodities meals. During the hardest stretches, the Depression years especially, and later during the lean years of the war, some families received government surplus food, blocks of processed cheese, cans of powdered eggs, sacks of flour and cornmeal stamped plain, no brand name at all, just a label telling you what was inside. A woman receiving these commodities didn't turn her nose up at them. She took that block of government cheese and melted it down into a sauce for whatever macaroni she could find. She took that powdered egg and turned it into something close enough to scrambled eggs that a hungry child didn't ask too many questions. There was no shame in accepting what was offered because pride didn't feed children, and every mother in that situation understood that better than anybody standing in judgment from the outside ever could. She took what the government gave her, added her own hands and her own knowledge to it, and turned government commodities into something that, at least for one evening, tasted like it had come from her own kitchen and nowhere else. Number 21. Squirrel and rabbit stew. In the rural South, a man with a gun and some patience could put meat on the table without spending a single dime at a store, and squirrel and rabbit were two of the most common catches. A pot of squirrel stew, cooked low with onions and whatever root vegetables were in season, potatoes if there were potatoes, turned tough, gamey meat into something tender and rich after hours on the stove. My granddaddy hunted every fall and most of the winter, not for sport, but because a squirrel in the pot meant one less thing his wife had to figure out how to buy that week. He taught his sons to hunt the same way, not as a hobby, but as a responsibility, the same way you'd teach a child to work a garden or fix a fence. Feeding the family was everybody's job, even the smallest hands in the house, and a boy who brought home 2 squirrels for supper had done something his whole family was proud of. Number 22. Fish head stew. When the men of the house went fishing, and in a lot of these families, they went often because a river or a creek nearby meant free food if you had the patience to catch it. The fish itself might be fried up whole or filleted for supper, but the heads never got thrown away. Boiled down with onion, pepper, sometimes a little tomato. If the garden had produced any that year, those fish heads made a stock rich with flavor that most people today would pay good money for in a fancy restaurant, not realizing it started out as the part everybody else discards. That stock, poured over rice, seasoned right, fed a family every bit as well as the fillies had the night before. Nothing about that fish went to waste, from the head all the way down to the tail. And there was a particular kind of skill, passed mother to daughter, father to son, in knowing exactly how to use every single part of what the water had provided. Number 23. Water gravy. Now, this next one. This is the one that separates the families who had a little something from the families who truly, truly had nothing at all. Water gravy, sometimes called Hoover gravy, after the president most poor families blamed for the hardest years of the Depression, had no meat drippings in it whatsoever, no fatback, no bacon grease, just flour, brown dark and slow, in a dry skillet until it took on color, then thinned out with water alone, salted, and poured over whatever bread was in the house. There was no meat to season it because there was no meat in the house, period. Not that week, maybe not that month. A family eating water gravy over biscuits was a family standing right at the edge of what a human being could survive on, and they made it. They got through it, not because it tasted good. It didn't, not really, but because a mother stood at that stove and refused to let her children go to bed with absolutely nothing on their plates. You won't see that today, and I hope to God none of you ever have to. Number 24. Sunday chicken stretched all week. A whole chicken bought or raised for Sunday dinner rarely ended its usefulness on Sunday evening. The bones, picked mostly clean by the family at the table, went straight into a pot Monday morning, with whatever vegetables were left in the garden, and simmered down into a broth that, thickened with a little flour and dropped biscuit dough, became chicken and dumplings by Monday supper. What little meat remained clinging to those bones got picked off and stirred back in, making sure not one shred went to waste. That one chicken, bought with money that had to cover so much else that week, fed a family of 7 or 8 not once, but twice, sometimes 3 times, across 4 or 5 days. This right here, this is something we need to bring back, not the poverty that demanded it, but the resourcefulness, the refusal to let anything given by God or bought with hard-earned money go further than absolutely necessary. Now, family, before we get into our final item today, I need to ask you for something real quick. If any of this has brought something back for you, a smell, a memory, your own grandmother standing over her own stove, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It helps this video reach somebody else who needs to remember too. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you're here with me every single time we do this. And I want you to drop a comment for me. Tell me, what's the one meal your family made when there was almost nothing left in the house? The one that stretched further than it had any right to. Tell me about it. I read every single one, family, and I promise you, somebody out there needs to read your story too. Number 25. I want to tell you about a meal that doesn't have a name, because nobody ever wrote it down, and nobody who made it ever wanted anybody to remember exactly how bad that particular week had gotten. It was grits. Plain grits, boiled in water, no butter because there wasn't any, no salt some weeks, because even salt cost money that didn't exist. And it was made in a house where there were more children than there was food to go around. A mother in that house, my own grandmother told me about hers, would fill every child's bowl first, every single one. She'd watch each of them eat, make sure the littlest ones got a little extra scraped from whoever's bowl still had room to give. And only after every child at that table had a full stomach would she look down into the pot and see what, if anything, was left for her own bowl. Some nights, there was a spoonful. Some nights, there wasn't anything at all. And she'd tell her children she'd already eaten in the kitchen before they sat down. A lie so small and so loving that not one of them ever thought to question it until they were grown themselves and understood exactly what she'd been doing all along. That is the truest meal on this entire list. Not the recipe, not the grits themselves. The love sitting underneath them, invisible, unspoken, carried by a woman who went without, so her children never had to know what going without truly felt like. That is what all 25 of these meals have been about. Family, from the pot liquor all the way down to this. It was never really about the food. It was about what a family will do for each other when there is almost nothing left to give, and they give it anyway. Share this one with somebody in your family who's still carrying these recipes in their head and hasn't written a single one of them down yet. This might be the nudge they need before that knowledge is gone for good. Subscribe, family, because next time we're going somewhere just as real as today, there's a whole other side of this story waiting for you. You are the kind of person who remembers. You're the kind of person who makes sure the rest of us don't forget either. I'll see you next time, family.